In Search of April Raintree, Chapter 1. Memories. Some memories are elusive, fleeting, like a butterfly that touches down and is free until it is caught. Others are haunting. You'd rather forget them, but they won't be forgotten. And some are always there. No matter where you are, they are there too. I always felt most of my memories were better avoided, but now I think it's best to go back in my life before I go forward. Last month, April 18th, I celebrated my 24th birthday. That's still young, but I feel so old. My father, Henry Raintree, was of mixed blood. A little of this, a little of that, and a whole lot of Indian. My sister Cheryl, who was 18 months younger than me, had inherited his looks: black hair, dark brown eyes, which turned black when angry, and brown skin. There was no doubt that they were both of Indian ancestry. My mother, Alice, on the other hand, was part Irish and part Ojibwe. Like her, I had pale skin, not that it made any difference where we were living as a family. I lived in Norway House, a small northern Manitoba town, before my father contracted tuberculosis. Then we moved to Winnipeg. I used to hear him talk about TB and how it caused him to lose everything he'd worked for. Both my mom and my dad always took this medicine, and I always thought it was because of TB. Although we moved from one rundown house to another, I always remember one on Jarvis Avenue. And of course, we were always on welfare. I knew that from the way that my dad used to talk. Sometimes he would put himself down, and sometimes he counted the days till he could walk down to the place where they gave out checks and food stamps. It seemed to me that after the welfare check days came the medicine days. That was when my parents would take a lot of medicine, and it always changed them. Mom, who was usually quiet and calm, would talk and laugh in a loud, obnoxious way, and Dad, who already talked and laughed a lot, just got clumsier. The times they took medicine were the most were the times when many other grown-ups would come over and drink it with them. To avoid these people, I would take Cheryl into our tiny bedroom, close the door, and put my box of old rusted toys in front of the door. Besides the aunties and uncles out there, there were strange men, and they would start yelling, and sometimes they would fight right in our small house. I would lay on my cot, listening to them knocking things over and bumping into walls. Sometimes they'd crash into our door, and I would grow even more petrified, even when I knew Mom and Dad were out there with them. It always took a long time before I could get to sleep. Then there were days when they came with their own children. I didn't like these children either, for they were sullen and cranky, and they wouldn't talk or play with us, or else they were aggressive bullies who only wanted to fight us. Usually their faces were dirty, their noses were runny, and I was pretty sure they had done it in their pants because they smelled terrible. If I had to stay the night, I would put our blankets out on the floor for them, stubbornly refusing to share a cot with them. Once Mom had let a little girl sleep with us, and during the night she wet the bed. It had been a long time before the smell went away. My mother didn't always drink that medicine, not as much as my father did. That's when she would clean the house, bake, and do the laundry and sewing. If she was really happy, she would sing us songs, and at night she would rock Cheryl to sleep. But that was one kind of happiness that didn't come often enough for me. To prolong that mood in her, I would help her with everything, chatting away in desperation, lest my own silences would punish her back into normal remoteness. My first cause for vanity was that out of all the houses of the people we knew, my mother kept the cleanest house, except for those mornings after. She would tell her friends that it was because she raised in residential school and then worked as a housekeeper for a priest in her hometown. Cheryl and I always woke up before our parents, so I would tend to Cheryl's needs. I'd feed her whatever was available, then wash and dress her in clean clothes. Weather permitting, we'd go off to the park, which was a long walk, especially on hot summer days. Our daily routine was dictated by our hunger pangs, and then by daylight. Darkness brought out the boogeymen, and Dad told us of what they did to little children. I liked all of Dad's stories, even the scary ones, because I knew Cheryl and I were always safe in the house. It was very rare when Mom would go downtown to the department stores where they had ride-on stairs. Mom didn't like shopping. I guess it was because sometimes people were rude to her. When that happened, Mom would get a hurt look in her eyes and act apologetic. One day, I didn't notice any of that because I saw my first black person. I was pretty sure he was a boogeyman and wondered how he had wandered around so easily if nothing was wrong. I watched him and he stopped at the watch counter. Since Mom and Cheryl were nearby, and there were a lot of other people close enough, I went over to him. My voice was very shaky, but I asked, "Mr. Boogeyman, what do you do with the children you catch?" What's that? His voice seemed to rumble from deep within him, and when he turned to look at me, I thought he had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. Maybe, though, they changed at night. No, he couldn't be bad. Nothing, I said, and I walked back to my mother's side. When winter came, we didn't go to the park anymore. There was plenty to do with the snow around our house. Sometimes Mom would come out and help us build a snowman and our houses. And one December, we all went downtown to watch the Santa Claus parade. That was such a thrilling, magical day for me. And after that, I went to visit an aunt and uncle, where Cheryl and I had a glorious old time, feasting on cake, fruit, and hot chocolate. And then we walked home. Dad threw snowballs at Mom for a bit before he carried sleepy-eyed Cheryl in his arms. I was enchanted by all the colored Christmas lights and the decorations in the store windows. I think that was the best day ever, because Mom and Dad laughed for real. Not long after that, many people came to our house to drink the medicine, and in the beginning they all sounded cheerful and happy, but later they started yelling, and even the women were angrily shouting. One woman was loudly wailing, and it sounded like she got smacked a few times. In the middle of the night, when everything had been quiet for a while, I got up to go to the toilet. There were people sprawled all over the place, sleeping and snoring. One man, though, who was half sitting up against the wall, grumbled and shifted, and I saw that his pants were open. I knew that I should hurry, but I just stood there watching him as he played around with his thing. And then he peed right in my direction, and that made me move back out of the room. I went through the kitchen, and there was my dad sleeping on the bare floor, still in his clothes. I wondered why, so I went to their bedroom. When I put on the light switch, I saw my mother. She was bare naked and kissing a strange man. I guess she realized that someone was in the room, and she sat up while trying to hide her nakedness. She looked scared, but when she saw it was only me, she hissed at me, "Get out of here." I forgot about having to go to the toilet, and I went back to my bed. I tried to figure out everything, but I couldn't. A few days later, I was sitting on my dad's lap, and my mom was doing the laundry. A woman came to visit, but then it became an argument. She was shouting terrible names and began to push my mother around. Meanwhile, Dad just watched them and laughed, and even egged them on. To me, this was all so confusing. I just knew that my mom shouldn't have kissed someone else. My dad shouldn't have slept on the floor. That man shouldn't have played with himself and then peed on the floor. And right now, Dad ought to be trying to protect Mom, not finding the whole thing amusing. I squirmed off Dad's lap, walked over to that woman, and kicked her as hard as I could, yelling for her to leave Mom alone. I heard Dad laughing even louder, but it worked because the strange woman left. That winter, I noticed that my mom was getting fatter and fatter. When winter was finished, my mom got so sick from being fat, she had to go away to the hospital. One of our aunties came to stay with us. She and Dad would would sit around joking and drinking their medicine. I used to wonder how come they all drank this medicine, yet no one ever got better. Another thing, they couldn't all be sick like Mom and Dad, could they? So one evening, while Dad and Auntie Eva were busy playing cards, I picked up his glass and I took a quick swallow before he could stop me. Ugh, it burned in my mouth and my throat and made me cough and choke. I spit it out as fast as I could. It was purely awful, and I was even more puzzled as to why they all seemed to enjoy taking it. I felt so sorry for them, and I was real glad I wasn't sick. When my mother came back, she wasn't as fat as she had as when she left. The snow was all gone, too. We celebrated my 6th birthday, and one of my presents was a book. I took my book with me everywhere. There was talk of going to school in the fall, and I didn't know what reading and printing were, but I was very curious about it. I looked forward to school. I promised Cheryl I would teach her to reading and writing as soon as I knew how, but for the time being, I would pretend to read to Cheryl, and as I turned the pages of my book like Mom did, I would make up stories to match the pictures in the book. A few weeks later, we came home from a day's ramblings to find a real live baby in Mom's arms. Mom was rocking it and singing a soft melody to it. I asked her, where did it come from? The hospital. She was very sick. She's your new little sister, Anna. Will she have to take that medicine? It tastes awful, I said, pitying the baby for being sick. No, she drinks milk. The nurse came to this morning and helped me prepare some, Mom answered. I knew from the way she talked that she hadn't taken any medicine so far. I hoped that from now on, she wouldn't have to take it anymore. I studied the baby for a while, and it was so tiny and wrinkled. I decided I'd much rather play with Cheryl. That summer, Cheryl and I spent whole days at the park. I would make us sandwiches of bread and lard so we wouldn't have to walk back home in the middle of the day. That's when it seemed the hottest. We played on the swings in the slide and in the sandbox as long as they weren't being used by the other children. We would build sandcastles and install caterpillars and ladybugs in them. If the other children were there, we would stay apart from them and watch the man mow the park grass, enjoying the smell of the fresh cut lawns. Sometimes the droning noise lulled Cheryl to sleep, and I would sit by her to wait for her to wake up. There were two different groups of children that went to the park. One group was brown skinned children who looked like Cheryl in most ways. Some of them even came over to our house with their parents, but they were dirty looking and they dressed real in raggedy clothes. I didn't care to play with them at all. The other group was white skinned, and I used to envy them, especially the girls with blonde hair and blue eyes. They seemed so clean and fresh and reminded me of flowers I had seen. Some of them were freckled, but they didn't seem to mind. To me, I imagined that they were rich and lived in big, beautiful houses, and there was so much that I wondered about them. But they didn't care to play with Cheryl and me. They called us names and bullied us. We were ignored completely only when both groups were at the park. Then they were busy yelling names at each other. I always thought that the white-skinned group had the upper hand in the name calling. Of course, I didn't know what Jew and the other names meant. Cheryl and I were too young to realize anything, and she was usually happy-go-lucky. Our free, idle days with our family came to an end one summer afternoon. We came home, and there were some cars in front of our house. One had flashing red lights on it, and I knew it was a police car. When we entered the house, Mom was sitting at a table, openly weeping, right in front of all these strange people. There were empty medicine bottles all over the small counter and the table, but I couldn't figure out why the four people were there. A nice smiling woman knelt down to talk to me. My name is Mrs. Gray. I bet you're April, aren't you? And this little girl must be Cheryl. She put her hand on Cheryl's head in a friendly gesture, but I didn't trust her. I nodded that we were April and Cheryl, but I kept my eyes on my mother. Finally, I asked, "Why is Mom crying? Did you hurt her?" "No, dear, your mother is ill and she won't be able to take care of you anymore. Would you like to go for a car ride?" the woman asked. My eyes lit up with interest. We'd been in a taxi a few times, and it had been a lot of fun. But then I thought of baby Anna, and I looked around for her. "Where's Anna?" "Anna's sick," the woman answered. "She's gone to the hospital. Don't worry. We'll take you for a ride in a nice clean place. To a nice clean place. You and Cheryl, okay?" That was not okay. I wanted to stay. "We can stay with Daddy. He will take care of us. You can go away now," I said. It was all settled. But Mrs. Gray said in a gentle voice, "I'm afraid not, honey. We have to take you and Cheryl with us. Maybe if your mommy and daddy get well enough, you can come live with them again." The man who was with Mrs. Gray had gone to our bedroom to get our things. He came back with a box. I was more worried when I looked from the woman to the man, then over to one policeman who was looking around, then to the other who was writing in a notepad. I finally looked back at Mom for reassurance. She didn't look at me, but said in a very definite manner, "No, we better stay here." Sorry. She didn't look at me, but I said in a very definite manner, "No, we better stay here." I was hoping Dad would walk in and he would make them all go away. He would make everything right. The man with the box leaned in and whispered something to my mother. She forced herself to stop sobbing, slowly got up and came over to us, and I could see that she was struggling to maintain control. "April, I want you and Cheryl to go with these people. It will only be for a little while. Right now, Daddy and me, well, we can't take care of you. You'll be all right. You be good girls for me. I'm sorry." She couldn't say any more because she started crying again. I didn't like to see her this way, especially in front of these people. I hugged her. She hugged us, and that's when I started crying too. I kind of knew that she was really saying goodbye to us, but I was determined that we were not going to be taken away. I clung to my mom as tight as I could. They wouldn't be able to pull me away from her, and then they would leave. I expected Mom to do the same, but she didn't. She pushed me away into their grasping hands. I couldn't believe it. Frantically, I screamed, "Mommy, please don't make us go. Please, Mommy, I want to stay with you. Please don't make us go. Oh, Mom, don't." I tried hard to put everything into my voice, sure that they would all come to their senses and leave us. There were a lot of grown-up things I didn't understand that day. My mother should have fought with her life to keep us with her. Instead, she handed us over. It didn't make any sense to me. The car door slammed shut on us. "Please don't make us go," I said in a subdued, quiet voice, knowing that at the same time I was wasting my time. I gripped Cheryl's hand and we set off into the unknown. We were both crying and ignored the soothing voices from the strangers in front. How could Mom do this to us? What was going to happen to us? Well, at least I still had Cheryl. I fought I thought this to myself over and over again. Cheryl kept crying, although I'm not sure she really knew why. She loved car rides, but if I was crying, I'm sure she felt she ought to be crying too. We were taken to an orphanage. When we got there, Cheryl and I were hungry and exhausted. Inside the large building, all the walls were painted dismal green. The sounds we made echoed down the long, high-ceilinged corridors. Then this person came out of the room to greet us. She was dressed in black from head to foot, except for some stiff white cardboard around her neck and face. She had chains dangling around her waist, and she said her name was Mother Superior, and she had been expecting us. My eyes widened in fear. It was even worse than I had imagined. We were being handed over to the boogeyman, for sure. When Mrs. Gray and the man said goodbye and turned to leave, I wanted to go with them, but I was too scared to ask. Mother Superior took us into another room at the far end of the corridor. Here, another woman dressed in the same way undressed us and bathed us. She looked through our hair for bugs, she told us. I thought that was pretty silly because I knew bugs lived in trees, not and grass, not in people's hair. Of course, I didn't say anything, even when she started cutting off my long hair. I was thinking that this was like the hen my mother had gotten once. She plucked it clean and later we ate it. I sat there, wondering if that was now to be our fate, wondering how I could put a stop to this. Then the woman told me she was finished, and I was relieved to find that I still had some hair left. I watched her cut Cheryl's hair and reasoned that if she was taking the trouble to cut straight, then we had nothing to fear. Between yawns, Cheryl complained that she was hungry, so afterwards we were taken to a large kitchen and fed some of the day's leftovers. When we finished eating, we were taken to the infirmary and put to bed. It felt as if we were alone in that pitch black space. During the night, Cheryl groped her way to my bed and crawled in with me. That was the last night we'd share the same bed, or be really close for a long time. The next day, Cheryl was placed in with a group of 4-year-olds and under. I found out from the other children that the women were called nuns and that they were very strict, at least the ones who tended to my group. I've seen the ones who looked after the younger children smile and laugh, but whenever I saw Mother Superior, she always seemed so unruffled, always dignified and emotionless. But the ones who took turns looking after us gave us constant orders that made my head spin. One would want to hurry with this and that. Another would scold us for hurrying. Like at mealtime, I was told, don't gulp down your food like a little animal. Eventually, I figured out what the different nuns wanted and avoided many scoldings. My parents had never strapped us, and I never had to think about whether I was bad or good. I feared being ridiculed in front of the other children. I feared getting the strap. I feared even a harsh word. When I was quietly playing with some toy and someone else wanted it, I simply handed it over. I longed to go over to Cheryl and talk and play with her, but I never dared cross that invisible boundary. Most of my misery, however, was caused by the separation from my parents. I was positive they would come for Cheryl and me. I constantly watched the doorways and looked out front room windows, always watching, always waiting in expectation of their appearance. And sure enough, one day I saw my dad out there, looking up at the building. I waved to him and I wondered why he didn't come to the door, why he just stood there looking sad. I turned from the window, saw that the attending nun was busy scolding a boy, so I left the room and went to look for Cheryl. I found her down the hall in another room. I looked in to see where the nun was, and I saw that her back was turned to Cheryl and the door, and I tiptoed in, took hold of Cheryl's hand, whispering for her to stay quiet. I led Cheryl down to the front doors, and we couldn't open them. They were locked. I didn't know any of the doors except for the ones which led to the play yard at the back, but it was all fenced in. I left Cheryl there and I raced back to the nearest empty room, facing the front. I tried to call to Dad, but he couldn't hear me through the thick windows. He couldn't even see me. He was looking down at the ground, and he was turning away. No, no, Daddy, don't go. Please don't leave us here. Please, Daddy. I pounded the window with my fist, trying desperately to get his attention, but he kept walking further and further away. When I couldn't see him anymore, I just sank down to the floor in defeat, warm tears blurring my vision. I sat there and sobbed, for we had been so close to going home again. What are you doing in here? The nun from my room asked, making me jump. Don't you know what a fright you gave me, disappearing like that? You get back into that playroom and quit that sniveling. Then she asked why Cheryl was at the front and what did I intend on doing. I wouldn't tell her anything, so she gave me the strap and some warnings. That strap didn't really hurt nearly as much as watching helplessly as Dad walked away. A few days later, I woke up feeling ill. My head hurt, my body ached, and I felt dizzy. When I sat at breakfast table, I saw the already unappetizing porridge. I knew that I wouldn't be able to eat it. I tried to explain to the nun at our table, but she merely looked down at me and said in a crisp voice, "You will eat your breakfast." I made the attempt, but every swallow forced down pushed its way back up. Tears had come to my eyes, and I finally begged, "Could I please be excused?" The nun responded in exasperation, "You will stay right there until you're finished. Do you understand?" To my horror, I threw up just then. Instead of getting heck, though, I was taken to the infirmary room. I was bathed and put to bed, and by then I was feverish. When I slept, I dreamt that I was somewhere near home, but I couldn't find our house. I was very hot, and I walked, but our house was no longer where it should have been. I woke up and I called for Mom and Dad. The next time I went to sleep, I dreamed my parents were at the other side of the large bottomless hole. I had to edge my way slowly and carefully around the hole to get over to them. But when I got there, they were back over where I had started from. At last, I dreamt that I was finally running towards them, and there was nothing around that could stop me. And they even had Cheryl with them. I felt such relief, such happiness. Just as I was about to jump into their outstretched arms, I glanced up at their faces again. The faces had changed. They weren't my parents. They were the two social workers who had taken us away in the first place. Meanwhile, my temperature was rising, and the nurse decided I'd better be taken to the hospital. My dreams continued in the hospital. I was always on the verge of reuniting with my parents, but that was always thwarted by something beyond my control. When I was awake, a new kind of terror came to me. I guess it was delirious imaginings, but I could see a huge white doughy thing, kind of like a dumpling, and it would come at me, nearer and nearer and nearer. It would always stop just in front of me, and I felt that if it ever touched me, it would engulf me, and that would be the end of me. Sometimes its huge bulk would whiz around my head, back and forth in front of me. I was always scared it wouldn't bang into me, and I couldn't duck it or anything. It didn't matter if my eyes were open or closed. I could see it there, and it seemed to know I was scared of it. I remained in the hospital for about a week before the fever broke and the dreams became less intense.